Welcome to Reframing Climate Justice. I'm joined today in this conversation by two very lovely humans that I'll introduce to you now. I think you'll be seeing them on the screen soon. Hello there. We have Nary Götze, and Mamadi Ujuaje. Hello to you both. Mamadi is a co-founder of community-centered knowledge and has developed a variety of experiences and explorations around the Constitution and wielding of knowledge and power at different social scales and geographies. As a result of exploring constructs of modernity and coloniality, especially those which disrupt and divert attention from somatic and social healing, she recognizes the need to employ reparative and revitalizing methodologies, including art and nature-based and immersive techniques, to address issues of cognitive justice and community rebuilding. She works in partnership to explore and learn how humans navigate justice issues over time and space, and how all beings manage personal and social trauma within bodies located across the ecologies and territories of the capitalist scene. Mamadi listens with care and to the human and more than human to discern and deeply learn and share the knowledge that arises. Mamadi, it's a pleasure to have you with us. How are you? How are you coming into this conversation at the moment?
Oh, I'm well, thank you. And that was a mouthful of an introduction. I think what's resonating with me is the announcement today that the British Museum and the V&A are going to loan to Ghana. I'm sure you've all heard about it. They're going to loan to Ghana some of the artifacts that they forcefully took from them. I thought, how kind of them. Really?
How
And so,
kind.
yeah, lots of people are commenting, and I'm just thinking, have we moved on, really? So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Have we moved on? What other questions could we be asking? Thank you, Mamadi. Nary is a queer climate justice organizer and ecology student based in Berlin. Nary is passionate about exploring non-Western concepts of stewarding ecosystems in order to learn reciprocal ways of human participation in other natures and landscapes. In their work as a facilitator and political educator, Nary follows such questions within workshops or exchange spaces to nourish a process of unlearning around climate and environmental justice process of unlearning hierarchical and oppressive structures imposed on ourselves and the ecosystems that we live in. Nary is involved in political organizing around climate and environmental justice with Black Earth Kollektiv and is currently working in an art center in Berlin called Spoor Initiative, which is committed to biocultural diversity. Nary, also a pleasure to have you here. Hello and welcome. How are you coming into this conversation at the moment?
Well, hello. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for this conversation. And yeah, I don't know. I feel good. I feel like we're gonna have a wonderful conversation, and I'm super excited to be on this panel with yeah, a climate elder that we can all learn from a lot. So yeah, I feel very honored and super happy to get into it.
Exactly. I'm feeling also, yeah, like we have an hour. It's a big topic, lots to explore. And we also want to hear from you all who are listening and tuning into us live. So yeah, and this is the second part of this series. I've already seen some folks say, glad to be here for part two. So I'm glad you're joining us again. In our first conversation in this series, we did it towards the end of last year. We discussed that contrary to the more mainstream climate movement in Europe, climate justice is, and especially from a racialized perspective, it demands that we dig much deeper and unravel some of the institutional oppressions and social structures that have allowed the climate crisis to form in the first place. and which are responsible for ongoing social and environmental injustices now as well. Things like colonialism, past and present, capitalism, and classism, sorry. We concluded that conversation, which was just trying to ground us in what climate justice actually is, by agreeing that the definition of climate justice is always expanding, but that at its core, it's about community and moving forward together. It's about quote, defining new worlds, sometimes beyond our imaginations. So we're moving forward with holding some of that as well. And if you're just joining us now, I also encourage you to go back and check out part 1 as well. But today we are wanting to bring it back a little bit and further define really what we mean when we're talking about reframing climate justice. And more specifically, as the title of the webinar suggests, we do want to explore the relationship between climate, race, and the historical legacies of colonial systems and how this has really shaped the landscape we find ourselves in now as we're seeking social and climate justice. And so there's some examples that will bring that up, but Mamadi and Nary have so much to share. I also, as an organizer, so we are going to talk and share and move us through trying to understand what we're really talking about and what we need to have on our minds. So yeah, let's start from kind of the beginning. The title of this webinar is quite strong, but it started from like a topic of race and climate. And so the first really question just to put out to you both is, I'm sure many people listening have heard this phrase, there's no climate justice without racial justice. But I'm curious how you both interpret that saying. What do you feel needs to be considered? What's important to consider there when connecting these two concepts? What's coming to mind for you? Nary, I see you starting. Go ahead.
I'll go first. Oof. Yeah, how did we get here, and how does climate justice relate to racial justice? I feel like there's a lot of complexity that we need to look at, and a lot of history that we always need to look at. And looking at colonial history, I feel it's important to always acknowledge where it all comes from and what are like elements and factors that are relevant and how they intertwine. And in terms of European colonialism, something that is really important to consider is something I think Walter Mignolo coined that term, the colonial matrix of power, which is based on theology, based on secular philosophy, based on science, which basically grants and also solidifies patriarchal structures, which you can see a lot in knowledge production and this so-called subjectivity that exists within those systems of knowledge production, which in the end serve a certain group of people, which is mostly white cis men. And when gaining control over systems of knowledge production, that means also we gain control over how we perceive one's identity in terms of race, in terms of class, in terms of gender and sexuality. And therefore, if one has the authority over that and can define that, that also really influences how one can live and how one also interacts with one another on a social level, but also on an economical level. And I feel like in terms of like race and climate and race and capitalism, that is like a really crucial point, that if controlling one's identity, that relates then to the ways that we can produce and we can consume. And there was a comment that I read the other day in a comment section on Instagram for like a really problematic panel about climate justice. I had my rage moments over this. It was colonialism is not all about, I wrote it down actually because it was so outrageous. Colonialism is not all about skin color. It's about economic systems and natural resources. And that person is not necessarily like entirely wrong. But that person didn't really, or I feel like it's important to understand that race is going way beyond skin color. It's going way beyond individual identity. And one need to understand, or we all need to understand, that race, in the way that it was invented, serves as a structuring element for society that makes capitalism possible, that makes a division of labor force along a color line possible, which then just simply makes or this oppression, then is the basis of the generation of a lot of capital, which goes with the exploitation of certain bodies, namely Black and brown bodies, or also non-cis male bodies, and also the landscapes and the natures that these people and communities have been inhabiting. And if we want to understand climate change, and if we also want to, if we want to understand climate change, which goes way beyond carbon dioxide emissions, we need to understand that this has been made possible through capitalism. And yes, we have carbon emissions as a part of that, but we have also extensive exploitation of natural resources, of landscapes, of human identities, of culture. And that is only possible through othering someone, through creating a racial other, which then ties back to the colonial history that we just have, and that is so embedded within European, the European structure. Yes, maybe that's
Thank you, Nary.
awesome.
Yes, no. It was good to, I'm hoping that this is not the first time that folks listening are hearing about these connections, right? But trying to restate again, those connections are important as a baseline for what else we want to talk about. And just quickly, before I go to you, Mama D, there was a question about the topics that will be discussed so that folks don't get lost. And I think that's hard to say because we are practicing emergence and we're allowing for things to come up as they come up. But generally speaking, the webinar is seeking to talk about kind of how we got here, a little bit of restating what Nary just tried to lay out for us, and then how that's manifesting currently and how we are looking at that so that we can have a collective consciousness amongst the BIPOC climate justice organizing community to move ourselves forward, to move things forward. So those are very loosely the three blocks that we're going to try to move through. Mama D, what's on your mind?
Wow. So thank you. Thank you for the question. Thank you, Nary, for very comprehensively responding to that. I think, or I should say, I feel that I want to engage with the subject very consciously from this body in this time. Yeah. And this body has been through passages of knowledge holding, knowledge sharing, activism, all kinds of things which have interpreted it according to, the knowledge extant at the time. I'm feeling, though, that the more that I hear the expression climate justice, I'm thinking, climate, well, what is climate? Yeah. Are we talking about meteorology? Then we're leaving out some other stuff. Yeah. Because this is like how you're taught in school. So you learn climate is basically about meteorology. And we know when we're not only talking about the air because we live on Earth. Yeah, we drink and deal with water. So all the elements and fire and so we're really talking about the whole environment when we're talking about climate. And then we think environmental justice. What does that mean? Are we going to go talk to a tree and find out if it's okay, if it's feeling that justice is being served to? That's not really what we're doing. We're thinking about humans because we're always thinking about humans. Yeah. And we're saying that the systems that humans inhabit are unjust and they're having an effect on the environment. So it feels like, why don't we call a spade a spade? And it is systemic justice, right? The name of the organization that's hosting us. So that's really what we're talking about. And it's systemic injustice. So if anything, it should be called climate injustice, injustice towards the climate, because the world has been so human-centered. It's forgotten that there are other beings that need to be respected and lived with. Yeah. And if we did respect the earth, we wouldn't treat her that way. Yeah. We wouldn't treat it that way, the way we do. So thinking about race is is something that has arisen from the minds of some humans for whom it was expedient to do so in the course of colonialism. And as Nary has said, it's come from a theocentric origin, the idea of, God creating particular humans differently from others. And the whole kind of Renaissance thinking, and our sister Sylvia Wynter is very, she's written a lot about this, about the overrepresentation of mankind. And so you have, a situation where there are particular humans that decided that other humans were they had different gods to serve. There were different agendas around who we were on earth. And this developed, through the Renaissance into understanding that the rational human, the rational thinking human was the real human. Yeah. And the rational thinking human inhabited the mind, and the rest of everything else was in the body. So our bodies, the bodies of those humans who were not part of these constructions here in Europe. But these constructions in Europe traveled the earth. They didn't stay one place, right? They started going down to China via Ethiopia, and they went the other side in West Africa and Senegal and other places. And in encountering these different parts of the earth and recognizing there was, some wealth to acquire in these places, they had to come up with theories and ideas to justify this, and race was one of them. Yeah. But it was based on some older ideas, as Mignolo and people like Sylvia Wynter and a host of other writers. If you read them, you'll learn about these things. And so we have a situation that Lewis Gordon talks about, where he says, like 33% of the people on the earth decided that the remaining like 66% were inferior. Yeah. And they were inferior so that they didn't know how to steward or manage or live with the earth properly, not like the rationalistic normative thinking that the 33% held. And so they felt that they needed to let these 66% know that they're inferior, and they needed management. And so did the earth that they related to. And in the thing is that it stuck. Somehow they managed to convince 66% of the world that they needed management by the 33%. And that's called colonialism, right? And if you can differentiate them, they realize, oh, you know what? If you can differentiate the earth and its peoples, then you can keep them quarreling amongst themselves, so they never actually step back and think, what the hell, what's happening? How can we, the majority of the earth, the global majority, as it's called, how can we be controlled by 33%, right? Who are just like, they're greedy. They're just like, they don't know how to manage. They don't know the first principles like we do, First Nations, First People, right? Origins. But we're not thinking about that. We're thinking about quarreling between ourselves, yeah, and arguing and trying to be like the 33%, because after all, if they're superior, we want to be superior too, right? So the damage is able to happen because of all of this extractivism, yeah, and everything that takes place that has a consequence for the earth. And the natural earth of which we are a part, we happen to be able to speak, but we're not really speaking because we're not speaking together, because we took on this thing called individualism, and we said it's, you know, we want a particular kind of, we want to be different and separate, and we've forgotten how to think collectively, you know, like trees do as forests. Yeah. And there's no one particle of sand that gets up and says, you know, I glisten a bit more on this side. It's like sand moves collectively, you know, and maybe we need to remember these things, you know, let our bodies come back again and be in some serious embodied conversations, you know, so we can start to look again at the situation and realize that we have got a 66% of the earth. We've got a big responsibility of repairing ourselves as part of the earth and helping the earth to come into a situation of repair. And, you know, part of that is maybe recognizing that this 33%, why are they doing this stuff? Are they traumatized? I think they are. You know, you can't do so much violence across the face of the earth without going home and having nightmares, right? And so it's like, we need to get these people over their trauma so they start thinking sensibly again. But meantime, you know what? Look what's happening to the earth. We better start being responsible for where we are and collectively, you know, be engaging in processes of repair. So yeah, I wanted to say that the thing, I don't know if you want to talk about this now, but thinking about Europe, we think about Europe as this continent here, but because of colonialism, Europe is everywhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the, you know, Europe is, what is Europe? Let's think about framing Europe in ways that we can respond to it actively. Yeah. So, you know, maybe as we talk, I want us to think about that, because Europe is everywhere European behavior, thinking, and action is. Yeah. Never mind even about the colonialism. These are in the acts of coloniality. Yeah. And these colonialities that you spoke about of being, of power and knowledge. So these things. And when we're speaking about the environment, especially because I may say this later, I want us to think about not only the external environment, but the internal environment as well, because that too is environment, it's connected. And let's think about macro systems, but also the micro systems. Yeah. So yeah, I think that maybe that might help us make the kind of connections that will help strengthen us in our how we move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Mama D. Let's get back into that more in a bit, this internal environment versus external. But essentially what you both have shared so far is really about this kind of globalized colonial mindset that we're dealing with and that we are disrupting now more and more, right? These conversations have been happening, especially for the last 5 years, I would say. So people are becoming more conscious of the need to unlearn quite a bit of socialization. But there's still a lot of work to do. So yeah, but this maybe if there's anything more you want to say about this mindset that we're kind of still dealing with, and what we're seeing, how that's manifesting now, in this current state. I wanted to say also, you mentioned about Europe and how the impact of Europe is outside of its borders. And we talked about that in some of our pre-conversations, because the description of this webinar talks about environmental degradation and oppression in Europe. But it was the question Mama D posed but what about of Europe? Because you can't really talk about it. You can talk about it in Europe, of course, and I hope we do, but the impact of it is so global. And that's something that we have to reckon with as climate organizers, climate justice organizers in the European context.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just speaking. Do you want me to say something again, or Nary, do you want to say?
Oh, I like to listen to you.
We gotta meet and talk, you know, and yeah.
I'll come to London. I'll come to London sooner or later.
I'll
Or you
come
come
and
to
visit you. I've
Berlin.
been to Spore. I'll come again. Yeah,
Yes.
that's a great
Yes.
place. Yeah. So, you know, I was reading a while ago about a German plan to acquire electricity, energy to feed Germany. Yeah. But where were they going to get this from? They were thinking about the Sahara Desert. I think this plan was about desert tech. Yeah, and by around 2008 or something like this. I don't know what became of it, and maybe you're more aware of that, Nary, but that's crazy. I mean, you're going to sit in your office in Germany and think, oh, where am I going to get some more power from? Oh, I have access to the Sahara Desert. I mean, what kind of person, what kind of organization thinks like that? It's, you know, it's how Lewis Gordon described it. They feel that they have a right to plunder the entire earth with impunity. And without thinking, well, what's the impact of doing that? Let's, you know, cover some great portion of the Sahara Desert, and what might be the impact of trying to, you know, route to have these solar panels across this large area of the Sahara. One of it is heating the air, right? And you can't imagine the damage. Well, you can. I'm for sure we can imagine the damage that that would cause. Yes, you know, Germany would have cheap electricity, right? At what cost? And this is, you know, the cost is not considered. You know, people have rights, humans have rights, but they have responsibilities that they gotta think about. So when you know, oh yes, mobile phones are great communication, but there's a cost. And who pays the cost? Oh, it's those people who are not really people. They're not really humans like us. You know, they don't feel pain. Yeah. And then we build up a racial stereotype so that we can go and plunder and we can extract the coltan or the whatever it is, you know, bauxite extraction. I mean, Jamaica is such a small place, right? 2 million people, small land space, small earth space. And you can go and dig the earth in Jamaica because you want aluminium to cook your food in Europe or to cover your turkey when you're roasting your Sunday lunch. This is like crazy. What kind of thinking? So is this rational thinking? Then call me irrational. If this is logical thinking, then I just am occupied with a whole host of illogics because I cannot emulate that. And I think what has happened to you know, as I've gotten older is like, oh, actually, you know what? This human, this overrepresented human that Sylvia Winter talks about, I'm not that. I can't, I'm gonna think of another term. Either that or I'm gonna call those 33% you know, something else. Yeah. And then we try to recapture the human agenda of responsibility towards each other and towards the earth. Yeah. Sibling earth, you know. So my siblings, the mountain, the river, the, you know, all of these things.
Yeah.
I imagine the oil in the earth to be the blood of earth, Pachamama. How are you going to go siphon out the blood of the earth and think it's not going to have any consequences? And all for what? The amount of plastic we're surrounded with.
You already brought up some things about some language that we need to reflect on. And we talked about before, like reassessing some of the language or terms that no longer serve us and shifting those. So I think that's a really important aspect to bring into this conversation. So thank you. But Nary, please.
Yes. No, I thank you so much for that. Also, yeah, you said a lot that resonated, and like this point of like they don't feel pain. I feel like it also in this creation of race, it really relates to like just like cognitive dissonance around empathy, and it's really I would also say it's like from a European and Eurocentric and colonial perspective, it's like we don't feel their pain and we cannot empathize with their pain and their experience, and so that's that. And I don't know, something in terms of current manifestations I feel like current manifestations cannot be talked about without looking at historical continuities
Mhm.
of colonialism and colonial violence and capitalism. And something that I come from this background, I study ecology, and I had to I had to arrange myself a lot in my university spaces because it's a very like I study here in Berlin, it's a very colonial institute where a lot of colonial knowledge is not properly reflected on. And when studying ecology, you will deal with environmental protection and conservation as a practice, but also conservation policy. And in the West, it's really like believed that conservation as a practice is something that ultimately serves to heal the planet, to help the planet, that is inherently good, that good people are doing this. But it's I would say and I also don't want to discredit people who are in environmental conservation, because environmental conservation work, unfortunately, is really necessary in colonial times and in colonial ways of exploitation, but it's very intertwined, one and the other, which is often it's thought about it very, very separately. And it's because we really need to understand that the history of environmental protection is a colonial history, because environmental conservation and the policies around that are deriving from colonial disciplines. They are deriving from biology, from biochemistry, geology, climatology, ecology as like a wider field that intertwines all of these sciences with one another. And that has a long history. That has a history of displacement, of colonial violence, because the first actually like for the ones who don't know it as well, um, colo environmental protection is usually area based. So you have an area which is zoned and usually also fenced, in which then, due to certain laws and standards, there is a restricted use or no use at all. And that also was created like that during colonial history. And like one of the most famous examples is the Yellowstone National Park, the first national park that ever existed, was created in a huge settler colony, the US. And what is not known about the history of the Yellowstone National Park as it was created is that over 12,000 indigenous Native American people were displaced to designate this park, because the idea of this park and of all conservation areas is basically to create a zone which we protect, where nature, quote unquote, nature can be nature, which is already based on like a dualistic understanding of nature, where humans see themselves not as part of it. As they understand themselves as managers, as superiors. Like it really resonates to what you have been saying before, because we have areas in which we protect, and which are, like we're nice to those areas, we're treating them good, we're like letting nature be nature, whatever that means. Um, but humans are not part of that, and humans cannot interact with that, which really, really, really has contributed a lot to indigenous people being displaced, indigenous people not having access to their lands in whatever shapes or forms, in terms of water, food, spiritual practices. It goes on and on and on. And this dispossession is, we can see that today. It has been translated wherever we're going, and this is also something that is serving as a tool of power to keep indigenous people from their lands. A big example that is really not very known. I don't have the book here right now. Jessica Hernandez deals about that in her book, Fresh Banana Leaves. I can really recommend it. It's an amazing piece of writing. She talks about the Monte Cristo National Park in El Salvador, which used to be obviously indigenous land. And then with the Spanish colonization, and the genocide of indigenous people in what then became El Salvador, in what then became El Salvador, was motivated just by by economic interest. It became a cattle farm. It became a classic hacienda for, I think, roughly 100 years. I think the hacienda was created in 1850 or something like that. I'm not really sure. And then 100 years later, after a civil war and internal a lot of internal wars, this park, this hacienda was not used as a hacienda anymore, but the settler government, instead of, you know, the settler government had options, which would be giving land back to indigenous people, having a co-creative process with indigenous people and settlers. And I personally think giving land back is the only option, but like in the reality, there was also a need for compromise. But instead, it became a national park, the national park that it is today. And indigenous people had no right and no access to those lands in terms of, how can we actually like interact with those lands? And that is something that we have today. It's happening within this minute while this panel is happening. Mount Kilimanjaro in Kenya is the best example. It's being fenced. The water is being diverted for rose and other flower industries, which are mainly centered in European countries like the Netherlands. And so environmental protection even serves as a tool to further oppress. And this is something that we really need to understand. And this is also something that Jessica Hernandez in this book, Fresh Banana Leaves, calls eco-colonialism, which relates to white people of European descent having an overwhelming amount of control over indigenous lands. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Nary. There's so many examples of modern day extractions or eco-colonialisms that we could mention. But the overall idea of that is that these colonial mindsets are perpetuating the fact that this is happening in the first place, and that so many of us in the world, maybe I shouldn't say us, are ignoring that that's happening, or find it like, or other that even more so. And I'll point to the comments from Paulina and Ceylon in the chat. If I could react to it with a fire symbol, I would, because but I can't do reactions right now. But just pointing out how Mamadi's comments, and I'm sure Nadi's as well, kind of point to how when climate crisis strikes in European nations, there's always a comment like, you could expect this happening in other parts of the world, but not here, not to us, Ceylon added about the same when war is normalized in the MENA regions or elsewhere in the world, but the closer you get to Western Europe, it's like, oh no, what's happening? So yeah, thank you, Winta, for the fire sign. Yeah, so we're sitting with this. There's lots of examples we could bring, but we're really already getting into this idea of sacrifice zones, that there are sacrifice zones that exist, and we, as a global society, have just allowed that to happen. And there's so many reasons why that may be true. I don't know if you want to add any other examples to this. I see there are a couple questions that I'm trying to decipher. But
while we're deciphering, I can just add a little example.
Yes,
I want
please.
us to think, when you were saying about Jessica's book, Fresh Banana Leaves, I'm thinking about that fruit. Now the banana is international. It's a really international fruit. And and everywhere has their own kind of types and varieties and colors. It comes in so many shapes and sizes. But the European came along and found this banana and thought, yes, we like this. Yeah, one of the things, we like this. And we are here, so it grows here. Yeah, we're in Jamaica. There was or the Caribbean. The people in the like 18th, even up to the 19th century, the people who inhabited, who were considered proper humans, rational, normative humans in the Caribbean, these were the people who had the names of people from Barbados who were called Jamaicans. So when you refer to a Jamaican, you were not talking about an African or Indian or Chinese descended person. You were speaking about a European. And this is why I'm saying we have to recognize independence, if we can even call it independence, because coloniality continues, right? So this kind of independence, in inverted commas, was only relatively recently, yeah, in much of the world. So Europe has been there and is still there in very many different ways. But let's talk about in the Caribbean with the banana production. I'm sure you've come across all kinds of, like songs and stories about bananas and how they were marketed. But then what happened was that the people who were living there, they were eating a whole variety of different banana musa species, including the plantain, which had come from West Africa, with people who'd come across through enslavement, through the Mangamizi. And the war happened, but by that time, Europeans really liked bananas, and they were, oh, how are we going to get our bananas after the war, right? So I know what we'll do. We'll get the people in the Caribbean to start really eating bananas and let them abandon the crops that they were using, their grounds, that was very much part of the post-emancipation, people were cultivating their grounds and their ground provisions, their yams and their, the plantains and all these things. Let them eat bananas. So they, exported people who could tell, these people in the Caribbean, oh, how you could do all these different things with bananas. And so if we can get people locally to eat the bananas, then the banana will still be grown. So post the war, we'll still have bananas, right? I mean, at what cost, right?
Yeah.
And then, so yes, you had all kinds of marketing. And then, was it in the 80s with the new trade agreements? No, they were ready to jettison all the Caribbean and let's grow it where it's cheaper to grow. And let's, as I said, concentrate on first the Gros Michel, and then it was the, what's it beginning with? What's that?
Forget the name.
Cavendish banana. The Cavendish banana. Now that is very vulnerable, very susceptible to disease, the whole monocrop thing. Yeah. Ruining the earth. And we must really think, I heard you say, Nary, about the land. And I have a take on this word, the land, because I do think reframing has to go across our language, but also the history behind the language and the emotions it creates in us and the questions it can cause to arise in us. And I think of land as a verb, to arrive. So you have landed gentry, right? These people who arrive in another place and then they claim it. So to land is to create territory for oneself when one arrives. To land. Yeah. And what we're talking about is Earth. We're not talking about this state of territory, so an expanse of Earth with forests, whatever it is that thing, is that ecology, but it's made into an egology, not an ecology. Right? Because of the ego of those who come and land. And I think we need to think about that, because there's another word I want us to really question. And I just want people to adopt this language so that we keep questioning. And that is the idea of we're encouraged to be entrepreneurs. But the French root of that is to enter and take. To enter and take. That's the word, entrepreneur, right? And then we want to be social entrepreneurs. How can you be? It's a conflict. Oxymoron. You cannot be a social entrepreneur. You can't enter somebody's place and take stuff, and you're doing it in a nice way, right? So I think we want to call space business Capitalist extractive business is what we do, whether we're doing it in a distant place or we're doing it close at hand. So if we understand the language, this is not our language. This is not the language of stewardship. This is not the language of care and responsibility. We got to use that language if we want to reframe the agenda for ourselves with these bodies that feel it differently. So that, I think you were talking like here in Europe, we have become Europeans. We want to be part of the 33%, right? And so we've taken on a lot of this stuff, but we need to let it go. And I'm thinking of like, we want this identity thing means we get divided and ruled here. Like, who wears these trainers? Or we want this kind of toothpaste and not that kind of toothpaste. We differentiate. How many soap powders and detergents do we need? Right? And all this differentiation across markets. So certain people will use this expensive detergent and other people use a lesser detergent. And so you deepen the social differentiation and then the aspiration to become the higher consumer. And we are involved in that, knowing it's extracting from the places that we come from. How can we be doing this? So we want the latest trainers. And we get disconnected from the idea that those latest trainers or jeans or whatever it is, that we're creating amputees. We know this, right? We're demolishing forests by our habits and our tastes, and we are doing this here. So
I think people know it. I think people know it, but they don't embody it, right? Like the conversations are happening, right? It's like this shouldn't be new to people.
Yep.
But we have not been able to get us to a point where people are really embodying it and therefore directing their lives that way. And there's many things about that. We are all still surviving capitalism. So like, yes. And also because we all are living, and we're talking about BIPOC climate movements in Europe, right? So all of us are living in the belly of the beast. And no matter what our current status is in this system, it still is largely more privileged than many other places in the world, right? We talked a lot about that. I'm cautious of
this word privilege. Privilege gets to be a word that's kind of like good in some ways, better, you have something more, right? But it isn't, right? Because the more privileged materially, because we think about it in material senses, yeah, the more consuming you are. So like one has to question whether one wants to be privileged because it means to move towards greater consumption. And we need to infuse that word privilege with different values.
Yeah, I think so too.
Yeah. And if we
like
do
what?
that,
What would we impute it with, for example?
Like, you got
Nary?
something coming at you?
Yeah. I feel like what's lacking with privilege often is, or like with the awareness around privilege, is that people don't understand that your privilege is that privilege in itself is a hierarchical term, that it is based on an understanding that I have more because you have less. And it's also a matter of acknowledging privilege. And this is also something that on one side, a lot of people who hold privileges want to be privileged, especially in a material sense, but then also fail to acknowledge that they are privileged in a structural way, especially when it comes to, for example, identities, and really don't want to acknowledge the privilege that they hold, because it also puts you in a position of responsibility of acting on your privilege and actually not just like using, quote unquote, using your privilege in transformative ways, but also systemically and constantly working towards dismantling privilege as a concept, because that means dismantling the hierarchy as a concept. And that also puts people then out of their comfort zones, because with privilege you have comfort, and that is what a lot of people are refusing to give up.
That's it. That's it. It comes back, as you would say, I'm sure, Sami, to the body. How are we navigating this work with our bodies, but not only with our individualized bodies, but our connected bodies, because that hierarchy is about a relation. So what other kinds of relation are we wanting to embody and, go for and support and enthuse people about? How can we do this work? Because this is where I'm talking about now, some of them, the internal environment that we have to work on. So when, any systemic justice work has to deal with both environments.
So I want to ask you both how this all shows up in your work, because this series is about bringing on people who are doing things and are active in the BIPOC climate justice movement. However, we all define that. We are defining it as we move forward. But I do want to try to answer a couple questions that have come up. One is a very clarifying question about the references to 33% and 66%. Someone wanted a little bit of clarity on like, who do those percentages represent? Mamadi, if you want to just say quickly again, I think you were the one that.
Okay, so this is a Lewis. This is not. I wish I'd thought of it myself, but I got it from Lewis Gordon. Yeah, who you can look up as an American. How can I thinker, thought leader? Yeah. And he stated this as a way of thinking about race and power and control. So the 33% are what people now refer to as the global minority. Although, you know what? I hear us talk about the global majority, but we don't use that term global minority so much. Now, numerically, this is nevertheless based on ideas of race. Yeah. So there are those who have more power, but then we have to talk about material power because there's other kinds of power. Yeah, we know there's other kinds of power in this earth, right? And it's not all about material power. And there's wealth, but it's not all about material wealth. But those who possess more of those things, yeah, materially, are the minority in the earth. What is referred to as the 1%. But let's say they're about 33% of the Earth's population. Yeah. And the 66% then would be who we refer to as the global majority. Yeah. And this is not a division on race, because a lot of that 33% are wealthy, full of color, right? So we must be clear about that. It's positionality, access, and these ideas of material wealth and desiring more to accumulate to the self.
Thank you. There was a question about the chat and the many resources that are being shared there. We are going to save the chat and find a way to share those with everyone who registered for the webinar. So just to answer that. And Kester, thank you for all the resources you've been sharing in the chat. Also related to what Mamadi was just sharing. I'm going to ask your question in relation to Hannah's as well, for you both before we come to a close. So one question was about how racialization is transmitted socially when assuming that most people participating in it effectively maintaining it are probably not individually conscious of collective patterns they're participating in. That's one question. The other question was, how do you think we can reach reciprocity and not just fake healing of nature? And then in the last question that was just sent in was also from a sex worker escort here, that privileged people are often also very lonely, and that seriously impacts their mental health. So not really a question, but I guess more of just a point to bring into the conversation as well about the healing and the need for healing in so many different spaces, I guess. And not to forget that when we're trying to discuss topics like this as well. So any response to that at the moment?
I just
to that last one, but to the two questions as well.
But still, I want to really agree with that. And that healing has got to be all the different ways. The repair is of everything. There's this long history in Europe, because Europe needed to learn about branding on itself, on its own body. Yeah. in the Calvinist era, which hasn't really stopped, by the way, but in that idea that God rewarded, the good people with wealth, and if you were poor, it's because God wasn't, you didn't do the right things in relation to this particular idea of God. But that branding took place on European bodies first.
That's
Mhm.
what
It
we talked about. That's
was
what
here.
is talked
Mhm.
about in what's that? The Grandmother's Hands book about
Yeah, but
trauma in our body.
I want to recommend this book, and I think this guy, Jeremy Seabrook, needs to give me some money because I think single-handedly I boosted his sales. But it's called I'll write it in the chat. It's called Pauper Land.
Yeah.
And it really goes into it. It really goes into the deep history, Jeremy Seabrook.
Oh,
And it's serious. I mean, it will bring tears. And when you think of that violence, those bodies who had to live with that violence, it just like Resma says, it just blew through everywhere else they went. They didn't know how else to be.
mhm.
So part of the repair of us, and we must center ourselves because you've got to start here, right? You've got to start where you are. Yeah.
Mm.
I was speaking with a friend, what black bodies do, the black bodies who are not supposed to feel pain. Yeah. When we're in the presence of white bodies that are feeling pain, I see your face. I see your face, Nary.
Huh?
That
No,
says it all,
I was
right?
in thought. I have my notes here, and I was in thought.
All right. No, that's serious though. When we're in the presence of white bodies that feel pain, all our pain has to evaporate and we tend for that body. We don't go tend for that body and our pain gets
Yeah.
forgotten. Yeah. So all our scholarship is on how could we make the white body feel comfortable? Never mind our pain. Never mind that we're still underneath being trampled on in different ways. Right. So we have to care for this body. We have to respect this body because in respecting this body, it's a lot easier to I'm going to use the expression to talk to a tree, but to relate, because when you come out of the house that you're in and you walk along this tree-lined street, understand you're walking through enslaved nature. Those trees never asked to be there to be brought from wherever, to be planted in places that they do not thrive.
Oh, I feel that every time
Purely
I go
for
on a
the
hike in Germany.
purely for the purpose of human pleasure.
Mm.
These are enslaved bodies. We need to
Mm.
recognize that when we're feeling the deep empathy. Yeah. And what would we do differently
Yeah.
if we were managing and stewarding the earth? Would we
Thank
just
you.
copy this thing or would we do it differently? And where
Yeah,
does that come from? If not a healed body? Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
I
And
think go ahead, Nari. Yeah.
so I feel like this relates a lot to what I wanted to say to the second question about reciprocity in comparison to fake healing, because what in the question was called fake healing is that we are catering to our needs and we keep continuing to center ourselves within interactions with our ecologies and our surroundings. And reciprocity actually means to understand, to first of all, it means to understand what what is given to me, what am I taking, and therefore also what do I have to give, where do I have to contribute as a human, and that is only possible by understanding yourself as a part of a larger system, which requires you to not put yourself in a hierarchical position. And I feel like within Western countries, it's really stuck in regards to that, because something that scientifically is acknowledged so much that 80% of the natural wildlife that is existing is guarded and stewarded by indigenous communities worldwide. That is in many global climate and environmental reports that is noted, and it's noted, yeah, we need to include indigenous people more into our processes and da 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 da. What is not understood with that is that Western people also could potentially have the capability of doing that, of understanding themselves as a part of nature and as someone who also has a responsibility. And it's this thing of like, if we are including this perspective into our ways of capitalist exploitative production, then we would technically become better. But that is just a false belief, because at the end of the day, the ways of exploiting, the ways of understanding nature, the ways of interacting with an ecosystem and also with ourselves, because humans are also amongst themselves part of an ecosystem. That is the crucial essence of understanding reciprocity with your environment. And that means as well that you do have to deprioritize, in certain situations, your individual wants and needs, which are in most cases just based on really consumerism culture and convenience. Because that is like that's really where it's at within Europe, because everything that isn't convenient to basically the lifestyle that we have established in terms of resource accessibility, in terms of energy accessibility, that is being ousted, that is being put aside. And that is also where people in the West are really masters at applying cognitive dissonance in order to just really not give a shit.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are already past the hour. I know we could go on talking for very, very long. I'm going to read the last two questions that came in, just so that they're spoken into the webinar right now and people can reflect on them. And then I'll ask you both for some final words. And again, like, if you want to say something about how this all looks and how you're organizing or what you're doing and the projects that you do, because you both do a lot of cool things, that would be great. I'll read Ceylon's first, and I feel like this might be something we can try to bring into the next episode on space. But the question was, do you all feel like focusing on the land and the place-based cultures we come from is a way to develop identity that transcends nationhood? Or have lands been too colonized, for example, banana monoculture in Jamaica? And then Magazi asked, is there a healed body, in quotes, in a system that is severely dysfunctional and only capitalizes on the pain associated with exploitation of people and land? I question if a healed body even exists. I believe that healing is similar to the concept of freedom, that it can only be achieved by everyone or none. So with that, I'll let that sit and ask you both to, if you have any other words, any last words that you'd like to share.
I actually brought a quote, but I'm gonna skip the quote because I just want to say something about how we can all move forward, or how, like, what is a way of moving forward, and how can we understand moving forward, and how can we also organize. And that doesn't only apply to people who are highly engaged in political spaces or politicized spaces that are also very, like, not sometimes detached from the reality of people. I feel like it's a really important first step in many, many situations to acknowledge and understand the violence that has occurred. And that is often very, very difficult, especially when we want the acknowledgement from the perpetrator side, from the external, basically, that has committed big parts of this violence. And I mean, like, the last example of that is the acknowledgement, quote unquote acknowledgement, of the genocide towards the Herero and Nama in Namibia, because no Herero and Nama was actually part of this process. And I feel like, therefore, it's even more important that amongst ourselves, amongst people who are oppressed, and who are oppressed across different margins as well, that we have a responsibility towards acknowledging ourselves and acknowledging our histories and embracing our histories, embracing our differences, and also understanding where within our differences and our similarities we can synergize, we can practice solidarity. And as a last thing, I just want to say that understanding environmental and climate justice means to understand it as a social justice and as a historical concept, and as a concept that, yeah, as a historical concept. I keep it at that.
Thank you, Nary.
Yeah. All I have to say is what they said. So I'm gonna read a very quick
Okay.
set of words that we came up with that I think maybe responds to some of the things as well. Narratives of food and ancestry. So it's thinking about seeds as locations of bringing something new. Yeah. Seeds of freedom, seeds of sovereignty, seeds of resistance, seeds of authority, seeds of justice, seeds of the past, seeds of culture, seeds that last, seeds that last, seeds that last. What is a seed of freedom, a seed of sovereignty, a seed of resistance, a seed of authority? Pray, tell me, what is a seed of justice, a seed of the past, a seed of culture, a seed that can last? How do we frame the seed that became a shackle, a chain, a gospel refrain? How do we reframe the narrative grain that narratively became the grand narrator's gain? How can we reckon with the etymology of pain that underscores the refrain of screams, slow deaths, stranglings by chain in the fields, in the fields, in the fields that remain? Consider the seeking missile of the mosquito's proboscis in the tidal rice fields of the Punjab and South Carolinian black necrosis. Consider that when we account for the loss of lives, we do not adjust for unwritten down lies, and those stories which are not told met death early, were too bold. Those considered only a piece of a human, a piezza, quotes Winter of C.L.R. James, a part of the Louisiana cane piece, night soil carrying, all day tarrying, no peace, met death through harrying, lying, still and solid, separate districts due to laws of no marrying. Consider those whose identities are not romanticized, unstoried, their tales nowhere crystallized in our fiction or our factuals or our lives and their actuals. Those too decrepit to make it into history books, those sweepers of yards, measurers, field cooks, those too left a legacy, those too are our ancestry. So tears that fall also need to be intersectionally wept. Accounts of our histories intersectionally kept. You have to talk about the rhizomes, the suckers, the tubers, the mothers, the persistence of others, the resistance, the transparent or hidden resilience. Where are the theories from these which arise, when from the stories untold will we theorize? Who speaks and who does not? What discomforts are deferred and in so doing forgot? Where and how met were the needs? What, when, and who are the seeds? Seeds of freedom, seeds of sovereignty, seeds of resistance, seeds of authority, seeds of justice, seeds of the past, seeds of culture, seeds that last, seeds that last, seeds that last.
Thank you, Mama D.
Mm.
Thank you, Mama D. Thank you, Nary, so much. I see lots of praise for you in the chat for this conversation. I see links for where you can find this recording, where you can watch the first and the next 4 episodes on Systemic Justice website. So please do check those out. Stay with us. We hope to see you next time. Thank you so much to Deborah, who is our French interpreter, and Sumaya, who's doing BSL. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Sammy, for the moderation.
Thank you, love.
Yes. Beautiful
It is
contribution.
a pure pleasure that I get to speak with amazing humans like you. I don't think there's any last words from the organizers. I remembered to say that please listen to the rest of the series this time. So I think that's it. Thank you everyone who's here and engaged and wrote questions and was in the chat. That's amazing. And we will collect all this and send it to you. So Thank you. Have a beautiful rest of your evenings, your days, your afternoons, wherever you're at, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.